in beginning this whole conversation about democracy and about where we are, the relationship of dialogue to democracy, because for me that's really the thing that I'm interested in right now and that I've been asked to kind of really think about, is I have these three words up here: democracy, inclusion, and community. All right. And as I go through talking about this, I think you'll see why I see those three as related. Both we all live in communities. We all, in some sense, desire to be included in the places we do. And many of us live, those in this country and in other parts of the world, live under the notion of a democracy. But the real question is, what is the relationship between how we talk to each other and the conditions under which we can talk to each other and be in dialogue with each other, and our ability to both be in a community, to be inclusive with each other, and actually make a democracy work? I always like to use this photograph here because one of the things that's actually absolutely true right now with most of us in the world is that we are living among the most demographically complex set of people who've ever lived together, right? And we have neither, in the places in which we live, the infrastructure or the process that actually allows that public to actually do what it needs to do in a democracy, which is be in relationship with each other and in dialogue with each other. And it's getting worse, right? We're expecting by 2050 that there may be close to 9 billion people on the planet, 70% of which they're assuming are going to live in big urban areas. Of that 70% that's living in big urban areas, they're expecting that probably 50% of them will be poor, right? So what are the conditions that we're actually constructing, and what's actually are we actually in some sense building and architecting in the world right now that actually is going to sustain democracy? One of the things that's really important to realize is that, as communities become more complex and filled with people who are socially excluded, our life and the work in community is really going to be about our relationship with the other. People who we don't know, don't understand, in some sense, almost see ourselves oppositional to. So that's the conditions, I think, in some sense, that we are moving into and that in some sense we live in right now. You can see it right now, right? In any city, any place, right? You walk down the street, you see someone homeless, and we ask, in some sense, that person becomes the other, right? Can I approach that person as a human being, as another human being, who's not necessarily there because there is something wrong with them, but actually they're there because of an architecture of a system that we've created, and they happen to be the margins of that system that keeps it going. So this notion of how we actually, not this notion, but just this realization that we are going to be living more and more and more with people who we see as the other, also is a challenge coming before us in relationship to thinking about community. So here's a challenge, though. Without the full participation of those who are least served in the world, I believe we can't find peaceful, sustainable, or equitable solutions to the issues that are confronting the world. Now, why do I say that? Well, part of the reason I say this is because people who are at the margins of society are actually the ones who are living with the failures of the system. And they are also the ones who are innovating around that failure. They are finding solutions and ways to deal with what we aren't doing and actually figure out how to build a life out of that. So if we're trying to build a peaceful world, if we're trying to build a society that's actually going to work for everyone, we can't do it by leaving out not just people because they're marginalized, but it's also because they know things we need to know, that need to be known in order to actually arrive and build and construct a peaceful world. This is a situation we're in, right? We're in these cities. I want to talk about cities a lot now. It's not the only place this is true, but it's what I know mostly. We're in these cities where with people who are demographically complex, the cities are getting larger and bigger. There's all kinds of issues going on. People inside the cities that are trying to run them, the mayors, the police office, whatever it is, are really basically saying, look, we don't have any way to actually, in a good, productive way, engage the public in these, what's going on, and having the public really tell us collectively what we need. So what we're doing is we're relying more and more and more on data as a vehicle to tell us what the public wants, right? So you see this happening all over, right? You see this notion of big data as a solution to actually the construction of society, right? And helping us figure out what's wrong. Probably many of you have seen these, you have these apps now that you can get on your phone, right? Where you drive down the street, if you hit a pothole, it actually sends a message to the Department of Public Works and says, there's a pothole at the corner of 12th and this, right? That doesn't guarantee it's going to get fixed, but at least they know that it's there, right? But all of these efforts, right, to collect data, to understand what's going on by, the way I like to say it is looking at the residual of your life, right? It's actually not who you are, not what you're doing, but it's just the things that you're leaving behind as you move through life daily to day are more and more what we're starting to rely on. And I think it's problematic. And one of the ways I think about this is, let me tell the story about something that happened to me many years ago. I was in Nicaragua, and I was with some friends, and we were up in the hillside in this favela area, and I stepped out of a car. The car pulled over, and I stepped out of it, and I didn't really see what I was doing. And I fell down a ravine because there was nothing there. I'm used to being in the city, right? You open up the door, there's a sidewalk, right? I opened up the door, there was nothing, and down I went, right? And I got hurt pretty bad, but I thought, hey, I'm okay. And the next day, we were flying to Costa Rica, and I couldn't get off the plane. I couldn't move, right? So I got carried off the plane. I was put in a hospital in Costa Rica. Luckily, I was flying with some friends who were physicians. They put me in traction, and they were really concerned because a year earlier, I had had surgery on my neck because I had a disc in my neck had fractured. And they had thought, oh my God, this thing has actually lodged against his spine and he can't move and he's paralyzed. So the organization I was with flew me back to the United States, right? And I ended up back in the United States, and I'm with the surgeon who did all this, and I'm in the hospital here in the Boston area, and they do bone scans of me, they do x-rays, they do MRIs, and after about 2.5, 3 weeks, they do what doctors do when they don't really know what's going on. They say, go home and get bed rest. I wasn't walking any better. I was in a lot of pain. It was excruciating, but I went. And then a friend of mine called me up and says, hey, I got this friend who's actually moving to the Boston area. She's an orthopedic surgeon, but she's actually changing. She's going to become this holistic doctor. You should go see her. So I went to see her. I called her up. She said, come on over. I went to her office. She opened, I go in. She puts me into the examination room. And then she comes in, and she proceeds to touch me all over my body. And I realized she was the first medical profession who had touched my whole body. Everybody was trying to cure me by looking at representations of me, right? Not by actually engaging with my body. I think this is a challenge we're facing right now as our society gets more and more with technology and information. We are tending to start to make decisions by looking at the representations of the public, but actually not creating the way for the public to touch each other and for us to touch them and really get that set of knowledge, which is absolutely necessary. So for me, I want to spend the rest of the time talking about some of the things I think are needed to actually make that happen. And the first for me is really thinking about, well, what do we mean by community? I have this friend called Moore, and he wrote this quote 30-something years ago about community, and then I made a couple of changes to it, put the word democracy here, because I think it's right on. He says community, and my notion here, I'll say democracy, exist when people who are interdependent struggle with the traditions that bind them and the interests that separate them so that they can realize a future that's an equitable improvement on the past. Now I want to talk about this a little bit because for me this is an anchor kind of definition. So the first thing is he talks about people being interdependent. The recognition, right, what he's saying is like, if people are willing to recognize that their lives are interconnected, that is the first step for them to be able to actually do something together. But the second word he has here is struggle. And I love this, right? Because a lot of times when we talk about democracy, we're kind of like in la-la land, right? You know, it kind of works, we vote, we do this, we do this. But what he's saying in here is like, this is a struggle, right? And by putting it squarely in the notion of being a struggle, it means it doesn't go away, right? It doesn't mean you don't have successes. It doesn't mean you don't have things that work out well. What it does mean is that you're going to always be in this, that there's work you have to do together, right? It's not as simple as saying we show up, we have nice conversations. There is work we have to do. And what is that work? Well, we have to struggle with traditions that bind us, right? What does he mean by that? Well, I can ask you actually that question, and I might just do that. Like, what are some of the traditions that bind us? Anyone?
Faith traditions.
Huh?
Faith.
Faith. Faith traditions. What else? Any other traditions? Yes.
Gender roles.
Gender roles. Yes. Definitely. I saw somebody else up here too. Culture, right. So this is the idea, yeah.
Political parties.
Political parties, right? So basically, by naming these things as traditions, what he's basically saying, there are things that they're binding us, and by being, by saying they're binding us, is they're holding us in, right? They're keeping us from actually being as full as we can be. So one thing we have to struggle with is with these traditions that are holding us back. The other thing are the interests that separate us, right? So this is okay, this is natural in society, right? Different people have different interests. They want to pursue them, right? They may end up separating us, but we have to figure out how we're going to struggle with that. The fact that, hey, I want one thing, you want another thing. How do we deal with that? But why do we struggle with those things, right? Because we want an equitable improvement in our lives, right? Not just an improvement, an equitable improvement. And the last thing, we want an equitable improvement, I always say, on what? And it's on the past. Now, here's why I love this, right? Oftentimes when we think about change, right, we're really kind of stuck in this place of really something that's so far out there that we don't know how we're going to get there. And we actually end up kind of depressing ourselves in some sense about the progress we're making toward it. Right? So by saying that really all we're looking for is just an equitable improvement on the past, that's a step in the direction. It's not the end goal, right? Yeah, your end goal may be full equity. But the way you're measuring yourself for getting there is that you've actually made a difference for what you were doing like yesterday. And I love this because it recognizes something that's really important for us. And that is the fact that things take time, right? I had this friend, and I was telling some people the other day, last week, about this story, who was in Sri Lanka, and her husband was part of this thing called the Peace Force. And that's not the UN Peace Force. It's a group that actually works in communities that are really under conflict, and they try to support people who are there to do peace work. So that's what their work is. And she called me up one day, we managed to get a connection online, and she said, Ceasar, I'm with this organization here. They're amazing, the work they've been doing in this community, little community, and they have a 500-year strategic plan. Right? And I go, yeah. They get this, right? They get it. They understand what it means, right? And we have a hard time with that, right? I mean, if you look at our language, we have this incredible language for critique that we have in the world, right? We can critique anything, right? And we have this incredible language of possibilities, right? But what we don't have is a language of transition, right? Because that's where we live. And that's the space in which we realize that, yeah, I'm trying to change the Republican Party, but the best I can do right now is this. And when you're living in the transition, what makes it so difficult is you have to hold on to the things that you're trying to change while you're making change in it. And that's what makes transition so hard. But what makes it even harder for people who are doing that work is we don't even have language to talk to people about that and honor them being in that work, right? So people feel alone, right? They feel marginalized by even doing good work and don't see it as enough. I want to go back to this whole thing about this definition here. So again, it's like community exists when people who are interdependent struggle with traditions that bind them, interests that separate them, so they can realize the future that is an equitable improvement on the past. So for me, the work to be done is how do we actually create the spaces in which the peaceful struggle can happen? That's the work, right? If we can figure out how to do that, then we can actually figure out, we can help actually this demographically complex set of people who are living together actually start to do something together. And I think there are two parts to it that I want to go over. The first is we need to actually have some clarity about what are the conversations that the public needs to be in. Now, I don't mean subjects, right? Like we need to be in public conversations about housing or transportation, about healthcare. No, I'm talking about a different level of thinking about conversations. So let me outline some of these. So the first, I think there are 5 of these things. I'm going to name them and I'm not even name them quick. I'm going to go through one at a time. Because there are different types of conversations the public actually needs to be engaged in. The first one is what we kind of call these framing conversations. And that's where you're actually, the only purpose of them is for people to get a shared understanding together, right? Because our understanding of something is always very different, and it has to do with what we're bringing into the conversation, how we're each seeing it. I mean, as you all know, if we walked out of this room right now and went out on the street, and each of us told somebody the last thing I said, right? There's going to be 1,000 different versions rolling around, okay? That's just the nature of communication, right? So when you add on that people's experiences, and people have had different lives and stuff, if we are trying to help the public come together, the first thing we have to do is honor those experiences and the complexity of those lives. Because only by doing that can we get a shared understanding of what's actually going on. We ran this project on transportation in Boston, and we used this device I have called a question campaign, where we just did nothing but go out and ask people what their question was about getting around Boston. And then we brought people who had a similar question together to actually do one thing only, and that is share the experience in your life that got you to that question, right? Now, here's the interesting thing about that. First, when you ask people just to share their question, you got similar questions from people in different neighborhoods. Then when you brought them together from different neighborhoods and you asked them to start sharing experiences that got them there, what happens, you start to map the complexity of the issue that they're actually worried about, right? So we have to be doing and figure out and inventing more and more of these kinds of processes that actually just get the public to share understanding. Nothing else, right? They're not making a decision. They're not saying, what are the priorities? They're just purposefully saying, this is about shared understanding. And that's a different kind of dialogue, right? That's a dialogue about connecting people to their experience, to their past, to their history, and so on and so forth. After this notion of shared understanding, the thing that's really next for people can be involved in, the other dialogue they can be involved in, is the one of what I call about ideation or creating possible solutions. So you have a shared understanding of something going on in the world. You have a shared understanding of, I'll take what's going on in the context of what's going on in the society around police violence and black males, okay? Let's say we have a shared understanding in this room. Once we have that and we really understand the problem, we can actually start to then begin to start thinking about the issue of what might be possible solutions to that, right? Not what solutions we're going to act on, but just what might be possible, given what we have now understood about the problem. The next is this issue of prioritizing. Now, prioritizing is interesting, right? And I mean by weighing the value choices. So here's what's happening, right? We come up with a whole bunch of solutions that are possible. Often what we do when we're in public conversations or in conversations with people, we want to then say, let's choose one of those things, right? But as soon as you move to a choice without actually thinking about what are the value choices you're actually making, you hide a lot that's really important, right? So the next thing that we need to start to figure out is how do we create spaces that are intentionally about this, getting the public to do nothing more than understand the value choices that are in any solution that they might be looking at. And I think this is actually some of the most transformative work you can do for people for one reason, is values aren't absolute. They're trade-offs, right? People are always trading off one value for the other a little bit. I'm willing in this instance to maybe put a little more control on the police officers, right, to ensure that these black men are safe, but I'm also not willing to give them so much control that they can do anything that they want. So, we're always battling back and forth around these, the different values that we have when we're trying to make a choice. But if we don't understand them and have conversations about them, what we end up doing is making choices about the solutions, not about the values we want to agree on that we're willing to trade off, right? So the public often is in the wrong conversation. They need to be in this values conversation, but they're not. They're in this solution conversation all the time. That's what's being presented to them. And you see, there are organizations who do a lot of work around this. The National Issues Forum and others really have kind of figured out some techniques and do this quite well. So I'm not saying these aren't things that we don't know how to do, but they're not in our daily practice, right? These are not the dialogues we often find ourselves in all the time. The other, and I just can go around this, is selecting, I say, agreeing on paths forward. And the reason I put paths here is we don't have to have one solution to everything. We have multiple solutions, right? Multiple ways of approaching something. And those multiple ways are important because each way probably allows a different set of people to have power and authority in relationship to the problem. So by having multiple ways of getting at it, you're able to do that. Finally, last one is the public really has a voice. It needs to be in the dialogue about implementation, and they need to be in one about monitoring what has actually happened. So all these are really different sets of dialogues that we actually don't have infrastructure for people, right, for the public. And so no wonder democracy doesn't work quite well here, right? We're kind of in a space in this country where we see democracy as really voting. But my frame is voting is the artifact of democracy. The real work of democracy is everything that happens before someone gets in a booth and marks something on a ballot. And the more intentional we can be about that before, right, and particularly being intentional to bring people together, the better off we're going to be. So that was the first set. Like, people need to know what conversation they're in. And then I end up saying, okay, but we don't actually have a lot of those, so we have to think about how do we put those together. One of the issues we have in this society is, I like to put it this way, is democracy is no one's business. Everyone wants to use it, but no one has a responsibility to make sure it's working. And when we put like things for bringing the public together in the hands of government, I don't think government's bad and stuff like that. You actually have competing interests, right? Because the competing interests of government and the leadership in government is actually to stay in office and achieve some goals, right? And that continually clashes with the whole idea of how does the public actually come together and make meaning together, right? Because I can give you a funny story about this. We were doing this work in Boston, and we had this opportunity. We wanted to create these huge, well, I was telling you about the questions, right? We wanted to create this opportunity to just go to the public and ask the public to name their own question. It took us months inside of City Hall to get people to say and relax with the fact that it wasn't about telling the public what the question was, but letting the public name the question for themselves, because the fear was, what if they name something we can't take care of? And we would always say, well, of course they are, because there are a lot of things that are going on you can't take care of. You know, that's the reality. And if those things are real, right, and they keep coming up over and over again, it gives you some idea where people really want you to put your energy. But it's tough, it's hard, right? And this is what I mean by we don't have actually any infrastructure in place that's solely focused on how do we bring the public together in different venues, in different opportunities, and help them do what they need to do so the institutions that are there to serve them can actually do that, right? That's what I mean by democracy is no one's responsibility, right? Because there is no one who has that job. Even when Obama got elected first term, he had built this incredible infrastructure, right? Of connecting voters and people across interest groups and everything. And right after that, he created this cabinet office around civic engagement, right? To figure out how they can continue that. And I was one of the people they asked to kind of come and be part of that group, and I actually said no, because I think what he should do is turn that whole infrastructure over to a third party, not the government, and let it run with it. And you know, he suffered from not having that because I don't know how much you remember his first term, he kept saying, I need you behind me. But there was no infrastructure for people to be behind him. None, right? Because all the infrastructure was now in the party. And the parties are, again, aren't about that. Anyway, I won't go down that road. So let me just go on to a couple of things real quick, and then I'll stop. So this first piece is like, we really need to understand and create opportunities for people, for the public to be in these kinds of conversations and know which ones they're in if we want democracy to work. But the other part is, these things, if they don't exist, then we have to construct them. And there's some principles that I believe we have to use in order to construct them. And I'll go through them real quick. I won't spend a lot of time on them, but I can go into them in very much detail during question and answer if you want. The first is, whenever we're designing anything that's about bringing the public in, the first principle has to be, we have to design it so that it works first for the people who are most marginalized. Now this is often hard for people to understand, right? Because what we tend to believe is if we want something to be successful, we want the most people in it, let's design it for the middle, because that's where most people are. But every time you do that, what you continue to do is marginalize more and more people. But if you go to the margins, and remember what I said at the beginning, people at the margins are living with the failures of the system, and design a meeting, a gathering, so that it works first for them, you will inevitably cover people in the middle. Feels counterintuitive, but it works, right? Go to the margins, design first, so that they can be served. You will then serve people in the middle. Second is, you gotta design for equity, right? And what I mean by equity is not so much equity as an outcome, but you have to design so that equity is a normative value in the conversation, right? That space has been created for that. Because you can waste all your time arguing over this one, right? But you have to design in a way, and the guidance in a way that is taken for granted. The other is about systematic change. And what I mean by this is, people can get stuck in these conversations, and when you're actually trying to design and create one of these conversations, they can get stuck on the particular thing they're trying to discuss, one of those options that they may be looking at, thinking it's going to solve all the problems because they actually don't have a systemic way of understanding what's going on. They don't have a systems analysis of it, right? They don't understand the depth at which some of these things are happening. Just the simple piece of, you know, we want to have a town hall meeting as a way of getting folks going forward. Well, think about that question for a minute, right? I mean, how many of you ever been in a town hall meeting? Right, okay. So here's our modern day problem, right? Where did the town hall meeting come from? Small communities, mostly here in New England. Yeah. What was true about those communities? They were homogenous, either by faith, they were defining. One of the things about them is to define who was not part of them, right? And so we had to start answering our question, does a system that was actually built on an understanding, really designed based on who was not going to be in it adequate for actually building a new public where the rule is everyone should be included, right? And the answer is going to be, well, no. And so we're left back at the drawing board again to figure out how do we start to build something that's much more robust for the public that's out there. The last three things, real quick. One is this whole thing about designing for collaboration. We can't solve and we can't move on any of the problems we have here without figuring out collaborative ways to do it. That's why I said in the other thing about really looking for pathways for it, right? Because we actually need multiple ways to approach everything. Right? And the last two, last three, design for multiple ways of expression. The best example for me right here, a way of explaining that is, how would I have done this meeting, this gathering, this dialogue, if I had worked with a musician and 3 artists? It would look different, it would feel different, it would elicit different things, right? So if we don't figure out how to start designing gatherings for these different ways of expression, we lose a lot of what people have to offer, right? Because not everyone's going to stand here and listen to me or anyone else, raise their hand or speak out, right? Folks need different ways to bring what they know into the conversation. Design for the analog and digital participation. So this is a new thing for us, right? We live in this technologically rich society, telecommunications, real digital way, instant connection with each other. It is an amazing world. It is a bifurcated world. It is a world of isolation, even when you feel like you're connected, right? Even in being connected, because what it allows you to do is to choose who you want to be connected to, right? It's kind of like those old New England towns, right? Only it's existing in a totally different format. But the other part of it is, as I said in the story about myself in the back, these formats, as rich as they can get, as multimedia they can get, they don't hold and can't hold all of what we need to express. That means that when we're actually trying to create new spaces for dialogue, they need to be both analog and digital. And they need to coexist in both spaces. It's not about you need to build an analog world and people want to do that. And you build a digital world and people want to do that and do that. You need some way for those two worlds to communicate to each other, right? For people to exist in both and also for what's going on in one or the other to be communicated together. This is probably one of the hardest things to do. Because right now, if you go and you start doing some research on what's happening like in the foundation world, the philanthropic world, enormous amounts of money are starting to be invested in kind of digital participation. Money in organizing and things like that are going down, right? So in some sense, we're disinvesting in the analog, right, spaces in the world. And more are doing it in the digital spaces. And it's a problem. But if you really want to design something that's really going to help really us create these new dialogue spaces, it has to do both. And the last one is about healing. And what I mean by this is the public, all of us in some sense, are wounded by the way in which we have had to engage with each other. It has not been healthy, right? A lot of us can't go back and say, oh, every encounter I've had in working with people, has been really worked well, right? You look at public participation processes in most cities, people who run them feel wounded by it. The communities who feel like they've been misrepresented to feel wounded by it. We can't build something different if we don't also figure out how to heal the wounds from the past. Because if we don't do it and do it in public spaces, those public injuries will keep coming back. And they will keep limiting us in our ability to do something different. So I want to go to this thing. I actually believe this, that every effort to change the world for the better begins with someone asking why this is so and raising up their own experience to the world. And I think our challenge, really the challenge for democracy, inclusion, and community is how are we actually building new places for the public to be in that struggle peacefully so that everyone's voice can actually be raised up. Because that's the only way we're going to make the change that we need to make in the world. So my whole thing tonight is, I could have given you lots of stories about how different people are doing this, but I wanted to leave you with this notion is that there are actually some principles and there's some guideposts that we need to be paying attention to all the time as we try to construct kind of new spaces for dialogue, right? And we need to be purposeful about it because the reality is what we're faced with in this society, in this world, is pretty dire, right? If we don't purposely go out and start to build something new, the architecture of what's already in place will continue to separate us from each other. And that won't serve any of us in the long run. Thank you.